A wolf pack blocked the tracks, forcing the train to stop in the middle of nowhere. Frustrated, the conductor was ready to chase them off until he saw what they were surrounding. In that moment, he froze and realized he was witnessing something no railway manual could explain. The air was still, heavy with frost, as Jack Latham guided the midnight freight through the snowy wilderness of northern Montana. The world outside the windshield was blanketed in white, endless and quiet. Save for the steady hum of the engine beneath him, Jack wasn't one for surprises. 32 years on the rails had taught him to trust routine and distrust the unexpected. But that night, routine shattered. The train jolted as the emergency brake hissed. Ahead, a shadow moved, then another. Not deer, not people, but wolves. A dozen of them motionless and facing the engine like sentries. Their eyes shimmered under the train's headlight, their breath visible in the cold. Jack's first instinct was irritation. The schedule was already tight. Wolves had no business on the tracks. Hand hovering over the horn, he climbed down to scare them off. That's when he saw it. In the center of the pack, not lying, not hidden, but encircled, was a small figure, a flash of red cloth. A child. His boots crunched over the ice as he stepped forward, heart now pounding with something other than annoyance. The wolves didn't growl, they didn't move, they watched. And when Jack reached the girl, saw her pale face and lips slightly parted. In sleep, or was it something worse? He understood this wasn't just an interruption, it was a message. Something ancient and terrifying and beautiful was unfolding on these tracks, and he had just become a part of it. Jack Latham had always believed in rules. Not just the written ones, but the unspoken codes passed down in locomotive cabs and rail. Yards from Tacoma to Tulsa, rules like never stop on a grade or trust your instincts, but trust the rails more. They were carved into him, just like the burn scar on his forearm from a boiler valve in '94. A reminder that steel didn't forgive mistakes. So as he stood in the snow, staring at the wolves and the girl wrapped in red, his brain scrambled to apply any of those codes. But none of them made room for this. He crouched carefully beside the girl, afraid to touch her, as if that might shatter whatever fragile thread kept her breathing. Her skin was ice cold. She couldn't be more than 5, maybe 6 years old. She wasn't crying. She wasn't awake either, just lying there like the wolves had placed her down for safekeeping. Jack glanced up. The wolves still hadn't moved. One of them, large, with streaks of grey along its muzzle, made direct eye contact with him. There was no growl, no threat, just stillness, watching, as if waiting to see what kind of man he was. He swallowed hard and stood. The heat from the train seemed a world away now. This wasn't just a stop, it was a test. Of what he didn't know yet, but he felt it in his gut. The way a conductor sometimes senses a landslide ahead before the signal ever flickers. He scooped the girl up, surprised by how light she was. Her head lolled onto his shoulder, and she murmured something so faint he barely caught it. "Mommy's gone." Behind him, a soft thud in the snow made him spin. The wolves had vanished, soundlessly, as if they'd never been there at all. Only their paw prints remained, encircling the space like a ritual. Jack climbed back into the train cab, the girl cradled in his arms. The heater blasted warm air, but it felt useless. Nothing about this night followed the code, and whatever came next, he knew. The rails wouldn't guide him this time. As Jack adjusted the throttle to move forward again, the radio crackled, not with dispatch, but with static broken by a single childlike voice whispering, "They're still watching." The train crept forward, metal groaning as the wheels rolled over snow-dusted rails. Jack kept one eye on the girl, now wrapped in his emergency blanket, curled against the worn vinyl seat. The other eye flicked to the tracks ahead. His hands gripped the controls out of habit, but his mind wasn't in the cab anymore. It was back there, in the cold, among the wolves. He had seen plenty of wild animals over the years. Elk, bears, once even a mountain lion leaping across a bridge. Span in Utah, but nothing like that pack. The way they stood, not aggressive, not afraid. It was the formation that stuck with him. They hadn't surrounded her out of hunger. It was protection. They'd formed a living barrier, and Jack had interrupted something sacred. The radio stayed, silent. No dispatcher, no signal updates, just a low hiss of static. Jack tapped it, adjusted the frequency, tried again. Nothing. The system wasn't broken. He'd just passed a functioning relay tower an hour earlier. Still, the line was dead. He looked at the girl again. Her cheeks were flushed now, signs that warmth was returning. But her eyes remained shut, her small hand twitching every so often like she was chasing something in a dream. Jack reached into the side cabinet, pulled out a packet of hot cocoa mix, and stirred it into a cup of warm water. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. He set it by her side, just in case. Then he saw it, movement. Outside the window, barely visible under the moonlight, 2 wolves were trotting alongside the train. One darted ahead, weaving through trees, while the other stayed just far enough to be noticed. Jack blinked. They weren't chasing the train. They were guiding it. For a moment, doubt crept in. He rubbed his eyes, leaned forward, looked again. Still there. Still running. A cold unease settled over him. He was no longer driving the train. He was being led. And as the engine pushed forward into the darkness, a thought whispered unbidden in his mind, a thought he hadn't had since he was a boy sitting on his grandfather's porch in Wyoming, listening to old stories about wolves and spirits. Maybe they're not just animals. A sharp curve in the track forced Jack to slow the train. The metal shrieked softly beneath them as he glanced again at the child. She hadn't stirred since he'd brought her aboard. Her hair was matted with frost, and her small fingers had curled instinctively around the edge of the blanket, as if clutching for safety. He set the brakes and turned fully toward her, kneeling beside the seat. "Hey, kid," he said gently, unsure if she could hear. "You with me?" No response. Just the steady rise and fall of her chest. A small mercy. Jack noticed something beneath the blanket, clutched tight in her arms. It was a red knit scarf, the kind you'd find at a thrift store, thick with homemade imperfections. He gently peeled it back to check for injuries. That's when he saw the marks. Small scars, barely healed. A bruise near her collarbone. A healed, cut just under her ear. Jack's gut twisted. This wasn't just a girl who wandered off into the snow. Someone had let this happen, or worse, caused it. A name. That's what he needed. Something. He checked her coat pockets, hoping for a note. A label, anything. Nothing but a button half hanging and a crumpled gum wrapper. Still, as he leaned in, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, pale blue, glassy, but focused. She looked straight at him. "Are you my daddy?" Jack's breath caught. He didn't know what to say. He shook his head softly. "No, sweetheart, just someone who found you." The girl didn't react. Her eyes drifted to the window, then closed again. "They said you'd come," she whispered. "Who did?" he asked quickly, leaning closer. "The ones with the yellow eyes." Jack froze. The train hissed gently as it idled, the windows fogging, over from the contrast of warmth and cold. Outside, the trees stood still, but down by the tracks, half hidden behind a drift of snow, a pair of golden eyes reflected back at him, unblinking, patient. He shut the blinds. And for the first time, in years, Jack Latham felt the cold sweat of something he couldn't explain, trailing down his spine. Jack sat back in the engineer's seat, the cab dim, except for the soft orange glow of the panel lights. The girl was asleep again, her tiny frame wrapped in his old denim jacket now. Outside, Montana's vast nothingness stretched in every direction. Pines stood like silent guards along the track. Somewhere out there, the wolves were still watching, He hadn't been called Daddy in over 2 decades. The word opened a box in Jack's mind he'd kept padlocked for years, rusted over. With guilt and time, he saw Marlene again, standing in the kitchen of their Colorado apartment, holding a positive test and a smile that never reached her eyes. He remembered the fight, the slammed door, the one-way ticket she'd bought to Arizona. He never saw his son or daughter. The child never wrote. Marlene never called. He told himself for years that maybe it was for the best, that maybe he wasn't built to raise a kid. The long shifts, the hard silence he wore like armor, the anger he kept just beneath his skin. But tonight, that armor had cracks. He stared at the girl. She didn't look like Marlene. And yet, something about her mouth when she slept reminded him of someone. His mother, maybe. The way her lips pursed when she dreamed. The engine rumbled beneath him like a restless animal. Jack rose, checked the gauges. Still no radio contact. He leaned toward the mic anyway. "This is Conductor Latham, engine 4291, southbound. I've picked up an unauthorized passenger, approximately 5 years old. Condition is stable. Requesting medical response at next stop." Only static answered him. The girl stirred again. "Mommy said not to be afraid." Jack turned. "When did she say that?" he asked. "Before the red came," she said, eyes still closed. "What red?" She didn't respond, just turned her head toward the window. Outside, the frost thickened, coating the glass like paint. But near the edge, where her breath warmed the surface, a small handprint began to form from the outside. Jack's heart thudded. He reached for the cabin door instinctively, but when he opened it, the deck was empty. No wolves, no prints, just untouched snow. He stood there for a moment, the cold biting into his skin, until he heard a soft, deliberate exhale behind him. The girl, fast asleep again, whispering through her dreams. "Don't go where the red is." Dawn was just a faint smudge in the east, barely coloring the horizon when Jack resumed the journey. He didn't accelerate much. The girl, still nameless, was curled against the wall of the cab, dozing again, the cocoa untouched. Outside, the forest thinned, giving way to open plains, the kind that could swallow a man and leave nothing behind but his shadow. The radio remained dead. Jack reached into the glove box, pulling out a folded coffee-stained map, the kind dispatch stopped. Printing years ago. He traced the route with a calloused finger. The nearest town was Hollow Ridge, an old whistle stop that hadn't seen regular traffic in almost a decade, but it had a ranger station, maybe a clinic. He figured he'd aim for that. He glanced at the girl again, at the scarf in her lap, the red dull now under the cabin light. Something about her was off, not in a wrong way, just misaligned like a puzzle piece in the wrong box. Her scars weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. And the way she talked, when she did talk, was like someone who'd learned speech through echoes, not conversation. Jack slowed at a switch junction to double-check the track alignment. As he stepped out of the cab to check the rail position, he spotted them again. The wolves, 3 of them now, sitting silently along the tree line. Always at a distance, never aggressive, always watching. He turned back toward the engine, but something in the snow caught his eye. A footprint, small, barefoot, a child's. It hadn't been there before. Jack followed it for only a few paces before it disappeared, mid-stride. No end, no turn, no disturbance in the snow, just gone. Like someone had been walking, and then wasn't. He didn't know why, but a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature settled deep in his bones. Back in the cab, the girl was sitting up, looking straight ahead, her eyes unfocused. "This isn't the first time," she said softly. Jack blinked. "What?" She turned to him, voice flat. "You've seen me before," he frowned. "No, I'd remember." "You forgot," she said, like it wasn't an accusation but a statement of fact. "They make people forget, but not this time. Jack's hand hesitated on the throttle. The train idled, a low growl under their feet. "What do you mean, not this time?" She looked out the window, her face unreadable, because this time someone saw. Before Jack could ask what she meant, a gust of wind slammed into the side of the train, rattling the windows. And in that moment, just before the howl of air faded, he could have sworn he heard it layered within. Not a wolf, but a woman's voice, distant and desperate, screaming his name. Jack didn't sleep, not that he expected to. After the scream, if it even was a scream, he kept the engine humming at a slow, deliberate pace. His eyes scanned every bend, every open stretch of snow-covered track. He didn't say much, and neither did the girl. Her silence wasn't unsettling anymore. It was precise. She spoke when it mattered, and when she didn't, it felt intentional, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. As they passed an old, rusted signal tower, long out of commission, she suddenly sat up. "Turn there." Jack shook his head. "That's a maintenance line. It hasn't been used in years." She didn't blink. "It leads to the cabin." "What cabin?" The girl looked away, as if she expected the question to disappoint her. "They'll be waiting." Jack stared at the switch marker fading behind them in the rear-view mirror. The wolves weren't there now, but he didn't doubt they would be when they needed to. "Who's waiting?" he asked, more gently this time. She said nothing. Hours passed in a blur of steel and snow. Then, just as the sun began to peek through the clouds, Jack saw them again. The wolves. 4 now. One ahead of the train, trotting just fast enough to stay visible. Another pair along the ridge, keeping pace. And one, the grey-muzzled sentinel, standing on a slope beside the track, unmoving. They were guiding him. He knew it now, not in some mystical, abstract way. It was real. Their movements were purposeful, as if following a map only they could read. The girl stood beside him, tiny fingers pressed to the window. "They're showing us the way. You just have to trust them." Jack let out a slow breath, tension uncoiling in his shoulders. "I don't trust anyone that doesn't pay taxes," he muttered. But even he didn't believe it anymore. The wolves veered right at a split in the trees. Jack saw it then. A trail carved into the snow, freshly packed by paws and something heavier. Maybe a sled, maybe boots. The track narrowed as they turned onto a forgotten spur line, half buried beneath drifts. Jack adjusted the controls, hoping the train could handle it. The girl leaned close to him and whispered, "It's not just about me. You'll see." Jack looked at her, startled. "What do you mean?" But she didn't answer, just turned back to the window. Outside, the wind picked up. It howled through the pines with a human edge, like breath passed through broken teeth. And somewhere in it, like a voice long buried under snow, Jack heard a name he hadn't heard since 1997. Name scratched onto a birth certificate he never saw. A name that shouldn't have come from the wind, his own. The trail narrowed so much, Jack was forced to stop the train half a mile from the clearing. The snow had thickened around the rails, and even the wolves had disappeared from view, though their tracks still led forward. He bundled the girl tightly, in both his coat and the wool blanket, hoisted her gently into his arms, and began the slow walk through the trees. Each step crunched underfoot, the sound sharp in the stillness. His breath fogged in the bitter morning air. Then he saw it. The cabin stood alone, tucked into a pocket of forest like it had grown there. Shutters hung off rusted hinges, and the roof sagged under the weight of snow. But it wasn't abandoned. Not completely. Faint smoke rose from the stone chimney. Someone had been here recently. Jack stepped up to the porch and knocked, hesitant. No answer. He tried the door. It creaked open, slow and reluctant. Inside, the air was thick with cold, dust, and something metallic. A wood stove crackled near the far wall, but no one was in sight. Jack stepped in, boots leaving prints on the worn wooden floor. The girl was strangely quiet, her head resting against his shoulder. The room was full of old photographs, tacked to the walls and shelves, some black and white, others sun-bleached and curling, families, children. Several photos showed the same young woman in different places, a park, a backyard, always with a child beside her. But each photo had a small, strange marking scrawled on the back, initials, dates, and train numbers. Jack's stomach flipped when he saw one of them. Engine 4291, his engine, dated December 1997. He looked closer. The woman in the photo. She looked familiar, her smile, her eyes. He reached for a worn ledger sitting on the table. Inside were pages of scrawled notes, train routes, weather conditions, sightings. One entry caught his attention. Child left at rail marker 62. Wolves made contact. Survivor unlikely. No retrieval ordered. His fingers trembled as he flipped to the next page. A photo was paper-clipped inside, a grainy snapshot of a baby wrapped in red cloth. Underneath, a line of typed text. Unidentified female, presumed deceased, burial site unmarked. Jack staggered back. He remembered that stretch of track. He'd passed it, on his shift. But there'd been nothing on the dispatch, nothing logged, nothing official. The girl stirred in his arms and murmured, "You drove past me." He froze. "You were supposed to stop," she whispered. And as she looked up at him with eyes too old for her face, Jack saw something flicker there. Not blame, not fear, but a kind of quiet understanding, like she'd already forgiven him. Jack set the girl down gently on a cot by the wall, its frame creaking under even her small weight. The cabin was warmer now thanks to the stove, but the chill hadn't left his bones. He sat at the wooden table, the ledger still open before him, flipping pages slowly, like handling evidence in a cold case no one had dared solve. Most of the entries were vague. References to sightings, patterns of child disappearances near freight corridors, animals behaving strangely, names of conductors, some he knew, some retired, some long dead. But then he found it, a thin envelope tucked between two pages, yellowed, and sealed with brittle tape. Inside was a single item, a child's hospital bracelet. Faded letters spelled out a name, M. Latham. His fingers curled around the band like it might vanish. The date matched exactly. December 17th, 1997. He leaned back, stunned, a weight pressed on his chest. He hadn't misremembered. He hadn't imagined the fight with Marlene or the parting words, "You'll never see your child." But this wasn't abandonment. This was something else, something darker, something covered up. He stepped outside, the air sharper. Now, wind sweeping thin tendrils of snow off the trees. The wolves had returned, 4 of them again, gathered at the tree line, heads bowed. In the distance he saw it. A mound of snow disturbed unnaturally. As he approached, boots sinking deep. Into the powder he spotted it. Wood planks nailed together in a crude rectangle. A cross, weathered and leaning, marked the center. Blood stained the snow around it, not fresh but not old either. Someone had disturbed this site recently. The plaque nailed to the wood read nothing but a date, the same as the hospital bracelet. He knelt beside it and dug gently into the mound until his fingers brushed something hard, a metal tag. He pulled it free. It was a conductor's ID badge. Confused, he staggered back. His badge had never gone missing. Then a sound behind him. Soft footsteps. He turned. The girl was standing there barefoot, eyes wide open but calm. "You didn't bury me," she said. Jack's throat closed. "I don't understand. You kept going the first time. You didn't stop." His mind reeled. He remembered the long shift, the snowstorm, the static on the line. A delay report he never questioned. He'd driven past mile marker 62. He'd seen... what? Red cloth? He couldn't remember. She stepped closer, and her voice softened. "But you stopped this time. That's why they brought me back." Jack looked at her, really looked. She hadn't aged, not really. The girl in the photo, the girl in his cab, the girl in the snow, they were all the same. She was never meant to be found, and yet here she stood, alive because something, Wolf's fate, memory, decided Jack deserved a second chance. Jack stood in the snow, the girl beside him, and the wolves behind them like sentinels of memory. The grave marker still leaned into the wind, but it no longer felt like an accusation. It felt like a witness, a place that had held on to pain until someone finally returned to hear it. Back in the cabin, Jack packed what little food he could find into an old canvas bag. The girl sipped warm broth without a word. She seemed stronger now, steadier. But he knew she wasn't just healing from the cold. She was healing from being forgotten. He wrapped her up again and carried her out, boots crunching along the path the wolves had cleared. They followed in silence, not ahead of him now, but behind. As if their task was finished, the train stood ahead, black and quiet against the white, steam rising gently from its stack. As they boarded, the girl paused at the door and looked back toward the cabin. "They remember," she said softly. Jack didn't ask who she meant. The wolves, the land, maybe even the tracks themselves. Once inside, Jack radioed the central dispatcher again. This time the static broke, a clear line. Voices, emergency services on standby in Hollow Ridge. Help was waiting. The girl leaned her head on his arm as the train moved forward. "Will you tell them about the others?" He nodded, unsure what that even meant. "I'll tell them everything." As the train carved through the snow-covered landscape, Jack watched the wolves disappear one by one into the trees, their figures dissolving like fog in the sun. He didn't feel haunted anymore. He felt seen. The girl slept the rest of the ride. At the Hollow Ridge platform, EMTs took her gently into their care. Jack stayed back, watching as she turned once, just once, to look at him. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just held his gaze with eyes that knew more than they should. He never got her name. But that night, when Jack walked back to his quarters and looked in the mirror, he saw someone different. Not just a man who'd broken a rule or missed a stop, but a man who'd finally remembered. And the wolves, he never saw them again. But sometimes late at night, when the engine rumbles and the wind howls along the rails, Jack swears he hears. Paws on snow and a breath that carries more than air, a breath that carries memory. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe and join our growing community of thoughtful women like you. Where are you watching from today? And what part of the story stayed with you the most? We'd love to hear your heart in the comments.